Capital Markets, for the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the IMF, and is now an independent consultant. Stage left of him is Barry Bosworth. From the Brookings Institution, moving over, Jorge San Miguel, who is the chair of environmental law at Ferraioli, law firm in San Juan. And finally, next to me here on my right is Andy Rosenberg, partner at Paul Weiss. So maybe I'll start at the far end of the table with Charlie, and if you guys want to just kind of run through and explain kind of how you've become involved in this issue, and then we'll get right into the questions.
Okay, just very quickly how I became involved. One of my responsibilities at the IMF was I was the point man on sovereign debt restructuring for about a decade, and sovereign debt issues in particular. And we saw lots of fiscal crises, some of which ended up in restructurings, others did not. And so with that background, I stayed involved in government restructurings, and I have some clients who have various classes of Puerto Rican bonds, but I'm not associated with any particular group or class of bonds.
I'm Barry Bosworth at the Brookings Institution. I'm not as long involved in Puerto Rico as Doug was, but about 10 years ago, together with a group of other economists, we wrote a book about the economy of Puerto Rico. I'm trying to stay in touch with what's going on. I don't think anything new has happened in the last 10 years. So my interest, I'm not an expert on government bond restructurings or anything like that. But my interest is more in the Puerto Rican economy, which I think is in a state of severe collapse at the present time.
Thank you. I'm Jorge San Miguel, a local practitioner, particularly with emphasis on the energy infrastructure field in Puerto Rico, and have been there for 25 years, paying taxes, seeing little return for that. And working through permitting infrastructure and other challenges that we currently have, and have been becoming more acute. I have helped governments in crafting energy policy particularly, but overall economic development policy as well, and have helped start a recent growth and reconstruction think tank on the island to, again, help aid in the development of contrasting views and ideas to retake our economic growth and help reshape our fiscal structure.
Hi, I'm Andy Rosenberg. I'm a partner in the restructuring department of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. My involvement is comparatively recent compared to everyone else. I'm glad to hear that nothing new has developed in at least the last 10 years, so I can start on an equal plane with everybody else. And I got involved working with certain of the constitutional debt holders. Before this, I had worked on many of the larger restructurings that have happened in the last 20 years.
Great, thanks guys. So before we get into some of the nitty-gritty around restructuring and some of the dicier legal questions, I want to ask Barry, since you wrote the book 10 years ago on the economy, and because maybe some of the recommendations were not heeded in your book, to walk through the challenges that Puerto Rico's economy faces with respect to migration and growth and labor market.
I guess briefly I said that from an economist's point of view, Puerto Rico at one time was one of the world's most promising economies. It was actually referred to as one of the new tigers when it was to Asia. But it's basically was built on the notion of low-cost manufacturing behind a tariff of the United States. So it was very successful in the 1950s and the 1960s. In the 1970s, when the United States began to reduce tariffs, open up to the global economy, more and more Puerto Rico has had to compete with low-cost labor all around the world. Asia in particular, and I would say it's lost out. I don't think it has any future anymore in this area of assembly-type labor. And it's been struggling ever since to try to find a solution, a new direction or area of comparative advantage. It was a very poor economy after World War II. 20% was the average income compared to the mainland. For a couple of decades, it rose. It got up to about 40% at the end of the 1970s. Ever since then, it's just been steady decline. Today, Puerto Rico's average income is only 30% of the U.S. level, only half of the poorest state in the Union. So it's a very poor area. Poverty rate, about 45%, about 3 times higher than the mainland. Economic growth has been negative now, in fact, for 10 years. It has a very small workforce. There are arguments about why so few people work. Some people say they don't want to. Others say there's just no jobs. As a result of the shortage of jobs, people are leaving the island. The population is declining. It's down about 500,000 over the last decade. And all the prospects are it's going to continue. I think it's important to keep that in mind because Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And at any time, they can just pack up and go to the mainland. That's what they've been doing in recent years, in large number. The limitation they're going to have is as they leave, the houses get left behind. And the real estate market in Puerto Rico is now also declining, making it harder and harder for people to be able to sell their home to get assets to move to the mainland. So I think the economic outlook for the economy right now is terrible. I'll let others say something about the budget. I think the government has been living dramatically beyond its means. It's made terrible decisions over the last decade, particularly since early 2000s. And now the debt is up to basically equal to the income of people on debt. That's far higher level of debt than you would find in any other jurisdiction in the United States, not quite as high as say, Greece. But I think it's not payable. The debt agencies have said it's not payable. They have pulled the ratings down to junk level. And as a result, the Puerto Rican government is now threatened to default and is in default on some of its categories of debt.
Thanks, Barry. So, Jorge, I want to ask you to jump in here. How did Puerto Rico's economy, how have they tried to address, I guess, the growth challenges that they've faced, and how well have they done on that front?
Sure. And maybe picking up on something that Mr. Bosworth just mentioned, because it's part of the narrative that we keep hearing over and over. And for those of us who live there and have seen, the development of these issues over the past couple of decades, it is true that we have been in a declining mode over the past 10 years. But there was an exception. And the exception was, as you measure economic activity through the GDP's measurement process, which is the index of economic activity, there was a slight hiatus. And I'll explain that. I have it in a presentation. I'll be glad to reach out to provide to Doug and American Action Forum. There was a hiccup, and as I looked at this and analyzed for purposes of these types of discussions, I think it's important to look at the public policies that we had implemented and how they have changed to see whether they have impacted economic growth or non-growth. From the period of 2009, if you look at the index, we were in decline from 2006 consistently until the period of 09-10. At that point, you started to see a turnaround. We were in negative 5% territory. We were in non-growth, okay? We were in negative growth territory. You started seeing a host of matters and policies go into place. One of them was, for example, the implementation of our public policy for P3s, public-private partnerships. That was enacted in 2009. After that, you had severe permit reform. Puerto Rico suffers a tremendous permitting bureaucracy. There was very, very substantial permit reform in 2009 as well. You had an adjustment of government expenses in the period of 2009 through 2011. Okay? You had use of federal funds. We had ARA funds, the American Recovery Act funds, and we started paying suppliers, which is currently not happening. We also had tax reform, lowering taxes and reducing brackets in 2011. We had the PR 22, one of the main highways in the north, was privatized. and we had the process of privatizing the airport, which is today a private entity. And you saw the GO bond ratings go to its highest level in May or June of 2012, the best rating we had in 30 years. That little hiccup, we broke into positive growth territory between November 2011 and January 2013. And you see the downturn begin towards the election cycle, at the end of the election cycle, when there were threats of paralyzing P3s, no more public-private partnerships, or even reversing the airport privatization transaction, which was a very significant transaction. And you also saw in 2013 public laws that were reversing the permit reform, the tax reform, and again, no P3s since then. An increase in government expenses, and a commencement again of non-payments to government suppliers. So you have all these movements taking place at one time, creating a positive force that started pushing us from a very negative position to a slightly, although tepid, growth period, but it was significant that we came from -5 to +1, so it's a 6-point swing. And then you see the effect of, again, the uncertainty created by the policies that were implemented in 2013. Fitch, as you may recall, some of you may know, Fitch Ratings issued a warning on December 18, 2012, saying, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico General Obligation Bonds reflects the significant progress made by the outgoing administration in implementing widespread reforms, despite economic underperformance. Maintenance of the rating will require policy decisions that continue this progress and achieve budget balance and a slowing in the growth of long-term liabilities. They were saying, try to keep as much of what's been implemented so far. There was, the governor, I think, suffered, Nick, the electoral consequence of having reduced dramatically the expense side of the government, but it was the right thing to do at the right moment, together with economic growth policies that started pushing our economy for the first time in 6 years into positive territory.
So we've seen government outlays have gone down, but revenues have struggled in Puerto Rico. You have to go back to maybe the early 2000s to find the balanced budget for the Commonwealth. So now you have particularly Democrats in Washington, the Obama administration is saying the only way to break this cycle is through debt restructuring. So I want to bring in Andy and Charlie. Charlie, Barry said he thinks the only way to do this is to restructure some of the debt. Do you agree?
Yeah, let me answer that sort of two parts. One is sort of the debt itself, and the other is the flip side. On the debt, the quick answer is I do not think a debt restructuring is necessary, nor do I think that is the best approach to deal with things. Let me just back up and give some, that's an unconventional statement. Look, the absolute worst fiscal accounting reporting I've ever seen, including places like Haiti and Cote d'Ivoire, is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, in part because they've been busy trying to get around constitutional limits on borrowing, has created a plethora of special purpose vehicles, funds, entities whose debt is supported by the taxpayer with and without guarantees, but taxpayers supported debt. The way you would do by every accounting standard, including in this country, is you consolidate these into a single statement. They tend to report budget deficit and all this just looking at the biggest account called the general fund. So the first problem you have is trying to put together everything into consolidated statements which are never reported. It's not a matter of the accounting, and it's not certified by an auditor. It's just the basic way they present data. Second obvious problem. If the federal government reported its deficit the way Puerto Rico reports its deficit, our deficit would be well in excess of 30% of GDP. Why is that? Because all of the accounting rules
accounting rules say you have to treat repayments of debt as something called below the line, doesn't enter the deficit, that's a financing item. Interest payments are an expenditure. The U.S. rolls over in excess of 25% of its debt every year. That's how we get the high number. Puerto Rico's real fiscal deficit, as reported by themselves in the report they commissioned from Ann Krieger, is probably on the order of, at most, 2% of its economy. Countries which have 2% deficits, which have extremely long-lived debt, whose interest payments over revenue are in the order of 12, 13, 14%, simply have never restructured. What did they do? They adjust. The model is a country which is in an extreme fiscal crisis, which has lost market access, which can't roll over its debt anymore, which has a huge liquidity problem. This happens 2 or 3 times a year around the world. They do something which Puerto Rico can't do. They go to the IMF. They work out an adjustment program. The IMF gives them some bridge financing and dispersing every time they reach their targets, and it's not if they don't. And in almost every case, a default is avoided through the bridge financing. Normal market access is restored when the fiscal gets back into balance. They can't go to the IMF, but it strikes me that what they should be focusing on are ways to mimic the same process, to get bridge financing and a credible adjustment to bring their budget deficit from, say, 2% to flat in a few years. I'm sure we'll get back to this.
No, thanks, Charlie. So Andy, taking what Charlie said, normally a sovereign in this situation, I guess they could devalue their currency. Puerto Rico obviously can't do that. Or they could go to the IMF. Because they can do neither of those things, their government has come to Congress and asked for help. What sort of, if Congress were to do something, what would creditors need to see to feel comfortable with that, up to and including the restructuring discussion?
Well, actually, I want to pick up on a point that Charlie mentioned about restoring market access, because whether it's a sovereign, a municipality, or whatever else, a governmental entity, all of them need access, continual access to the capital markets. No sovereign, no municipality just pays down its debt and becomes debt-free. And one of the things that Puerto Rico has done, and they often rely on bridge financing too, one of the things that Puerto Rico has done is the opposite of that. The currency which they have is their constitutional debt or GO debt. Most sovereigns want to maintain the credibility of that so that ultimately you come out with access to the markets. The incredible attention that they have focused on their inability to pay that, the statement that they can't pay that, and many of the focus has been such that and they are going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, for themselves to actually get access back to the markets whenever they emerge from this restructuring process or debt adjustment process or balancing their budget process. So I agree with Charlie that they violated the most basic rules of how to get out of this by doing everything they can through the way they approach this process, to make it very difficult to access the markets in the future.
So then, so their first problem then was by declaring the debt unpayable in your view?
Certainly by declaring all the debt unpayable, that exacerbated the problem in terms of cutting off the ability to access the markets by saying your best currency, your constitutional debt, your full faith and credit debt is not payable. You have exacerbated the problem by essentially destroying the currency you have to do what many of these sovereigns and others have done by getting continued access to the markets.
So one question this raises is Puerto Rico a sovereign or a muni?
It's interesting. I would say in many ways you can look at it a little of both.
Right, and maybe that's through the problem. We won't get into the statement question or the politics around that today, but
definitely not.
The reason I ask is the question I wanted, the panel to get at is, how do we get growth back in Puerto Rico? So what I'm hearing from you and from Charlie is losing the ability to borrow is first order magnitude problem. No growth if you can't continue to borrow. Some people have said, well, that sounds like a scoop and toss, where you're just refinancing, taking on new borrowing, but you're not, if your economy's not growing, you cannot borrow your way out of this. So I guess I want to hear from the panel, can Puerto Rico's economy grow now with the headwinds that it's facing, whether they're self-inflicted or not? I mean, take the reality as it is. How do you get growth back in this economy?
Let me take a stab. I mean, this is a multi-layered, it's a complex issue, but I think when you have a complex issue, you start by focusing on credible, achievable, short-term steps. And I think the first thing that Puerto Rico is facing is it's not a liquidity deficit, it's not a cash deficit, it's a credibility deficit. We have had zero visibility as to public funds for the last 3 years now. We have, the GDP has posted on its website, you can look it up, consolidated audited financial statements, CAFRs, for the last 13 years. 2013-14, 2014-15, and now we're on 2015-16. We're going on our third year of no financial statements that anybody can look at and review. I just heard and read coming into this meeting that Senator Hatch, I think, just issued a letter today to the governor asking for that information.
But I think that's basic. Do you think the information that would be in those audited financials is going to change fundamentally the growth question?
I think the first thing is that for the market to sit down with you rationally and fairly and speak to you, you need to be open. So that's, I think act number one in trying to get a consensual discussion going about this. Melba Costa, the president of the GDP in the Walmart versus Commonwealth litigation that I'm sure all of you know about, testified 2 or 3 working days ago that she acknowledged that the first time the Commonwealth was sitting with creditors was in January this year. In June 2014, the governor said we had everything squared away. The deficit had been erased, everything had been corrected, and less than a year later, it is unpayable. And there's no visibility. Who are we to believe? I mean, I have no idea how we conclude in this panel, if we can, that in fact there is a crisis of the magnitude that's being said. The liquidity crisis that we have is cyclical. That's why the GDP typically uses the trans to finance temporarily the periods between the commencement of the fiscal year, which is June 1st, to December 31st, because most of the monies from tax revenues come in January through May 31st. So it is not atypical that we're going through the dip we're going to. The problem is that we closed our doors to the markets when we started talking ill about the market and the creditors and the hedge funds. And then we increased government expenses and we reversed economic development policies. When we throw that all into the same concoction of whatever we're cooking, it spells liquidity crisis, it spells no market access. And I think to get back to it, we need to simply say, okay, we're going to sit down. It is about public funds, by the way. I'm one of the taxpayers that's stuck with reimbursements and I'm not getting back. Why can't I have access to the papers of the government? If I go to my bank to restructure my 2 home mortgages, the bank president, whom I know, is going to say, sure, Jorge, go over to our restructuring division, and they'll treat you very nice. They're going to ask me for my financials. And if I tell them I don't want them to see them, they're going to say, well, we can't restructure anything.
So obviously transparency is important. I think almost everybody who's part of this debate would agree that failure to provide more transparency in financials needs to be addressed. I guess, Barry, I know you had your hand up, you want to get in here, but the question I have is, I mean, if you look back over the last 10 years, the debt burden has increased 64%, the population has shrunk 9%. These are not things that started 2 years ago when we no longer began to get insight into the financials. So back to the question of how do you get growth? Do you think, Barry, that more borrowing is going to be able to help accomplish that objective?
I think they just have to stop borrowing. The problem that Puerto Rico's had is to try to camouflage this problem year after year by borrowing and borrowing, and the debt is now at too high a level. There's no doubt that both political parties that who've been in office over the last decade made enormous mistakes. But the fundamental problem in Puerto Rico is shown by people trying to get jobs. What type of activity can you create in Puerto Rico that will create new jobs? And I think the problem has been going on. It's not cyclical. The economy's been in absolute decline for 10 years. It's been in relative decline for a quarter of a century. This is a long-term problem that Puerto Rico has failed to find an answer to, nor have the rest of us found an answer to. It doesn't have anymore an area of strong comparative advantage. It can't devalue, which is the first thing. And Charlie's work at the IMF, what do they always do? They just devalue their currency and start over again. Puerto Rico can't do that. And trying to have an internal, as we call it, devaluation, which is the effort being made in Greece, is that don't change the exchange rate, try to get everybody to scale back their wages and prices. It isn't going to work when people can pack up and move to the mainland and the poverty rate is already 45%. You're kidding yourself. These little measures about changing shipping rates into Puerto Rico and some of the other minor legislation is not going to fundamentally change the situation of how to make Puerto Rico more competitive in a world market. They have to face up to that. And you're not going to solve this problem overnight, and you're not going to solve it when you got the distraction going on in these continual arguments over the debt. The debt has to be consolidated, but once it's consolidated, it's going to have to be reduced.